Africa, a country full of deserts, rainforests, and fertile lands, home to thousands of ethnic groups like the Maasai, Anai, and Nkwe, each with their own culture, rules, and traditions. It is a place of many valuable natural resources like rubber, cotton, and tea that attracted Europeans looking for valuables and yearning to imperialize, divide, explore, and conquer. The Berlin Conference bewildered everyone, from the humblest African peasant to the master statesman of the age, Thomas Pakenham. The Berlin Conference marked the climax of the European competition for territory in Africa. Around a decade before the conference, during the 1870s and early 1880s, European countries like Great Britain, France, and Germany looked to Africa for the natural resources they lacked and desperately needed in order to maintain a standard level of domestic production. These countries sent scouts to the continent to secure treaties with representatives of the indigenous peoples. King Leopold II of Belgium wanted to increase his personal wealth by acquiring African territory, so he hired agents to claim territory in Central Africa. Even German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was previously uninterested in African land, felt compelled to venture into the continent due to the recent increase in global interest.
So the motives for European conquest of Africa are a little bit mysterious, right? Because you need to remember that the Europeans had been getting really rich off of trading in Africa for centuries, right? And so when they had, when they just started in the late 1800s to conquer territory very rapidly and seize control, that's at considerable expense, right? They had been able to buy enslaved people on the African coasts in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s. In the 1800s, when they had stopped doing that, they had been able to buy the things that were, in the era of the Industrial Revolution, important to them, rubber, palm oil, and other goods, without having to conquer territory, right? Generally speaking, they had had a very, very profitable kind of trade relationship in Africa.
As global interest in the continent grew, countries began to scramble for territory. The term "scramble for Africa" refers to the chaos that ensued during this period of time. In West Africa, there was conflict between Great Britain and France. In East Africa, there was conflict between Great Britain and Portugal, and in Central Africa, there was conflict between Belgium and France. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was wary of any involvement in the scramble for Africa, wanted to maintain peace among the European countries and decided to call a meeting where all of the involved nations' governments could come together and come up with an agreement for land ownership. Prior to the conference, Europeans treated indigenous African people in the same way they treated the native peoples in the New World. They would form trade relations with tribal chiefs. This can be seen in examples such as the Portuguese trading with the Kingdom of the Congo. Although the Berlin Conference was not the start of the scramble for Africa, it laid down the rules that governed the European conquest of Africa for the next 15 years. The conference was unique because normally international conferences were held to resolve the aftermath of a war, but in this case, one was held in order to settle problems before they led to war. The conference was held in Berlin between November 15, 1884 and February 26, 1885, under the leadership of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The result of the conference was a method of dividing the continent of Africa between the European powers. The present countries included Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, which was united at the time, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. The countries within Africa that were most affected by the proceedings weren't invited. Over the course of 4 months, the present countries collectively worked to draft an agreement that would satisfy all of their territorial desires. The General Act of the Berlin Conference, or the Berlin Act, was the end result. The act established the rules for the effective occupation of conquered lands that would hopefully prevent war among the European powers. Representatives agreed to have certain territories reserved as neutral, for example, the Congo River Basin. They also agreed to notify other European powers when they acquire new land, and to allow free trade among the colonies, essentially creating a legal basis for future territorial decisions. The events prior to and preceding the Berlin Conference show how this historical event started with a conflict between European powers that developed into a compromise, that being the conference itself, which ended up having adverse effects that led to future conflict.
See a river, they will consider that a landmark and say that is the boundary between my own territory and your own territory. Let me take the example, say, of Nigeria and Cameroon. All right? So they go to the Cross River, which is one of the major rivers there, and so the Cross River would be the landmark that would demarcate Nigeria from Cameroon to distinguish. Now, what was the impact of that on the tribal groups? Well, what that actually meant is that since the Cross River was just a river that, almost the same way you think about Mississippi, the people on this side of the river and on the other side belong to the same group. But when you then divide it and they now fly a different flag because they are a different country, and the other group flies a different flag because they are a different country, the result of that was this arbitrary division of tribal groups in Africa. And it even led to internecine wars among them.
The Berlin Conference affected Africans by chopping the continent up into regions that would be colonized and governed by various European countries. The European powers ran the economy of their colonies in ways that profited them. They did not allow Africans to participate in negotiations, and they did not educate them, which meant when it came time for independence, there were few Africans with the education and experience to organize their own governments. This pushed Africans steps backwards after their eventual independence because they had to essentially start over and learn how to govern themselves as time progressed. Socially and culturally, the human geography of Africa was not taken into consideration, as they divided ethnic groups into different countries and made countries out of multiple ethnic groups, some of which did not get along. In the social sphere, European domination anglicized traditional African values and customs that had been developing for centuries. European nations also thought that they had to conquer Africa because Africans were inferior and needed to be civilized and Christianized. It was this belief in social Darwinism and in the white man's burden that justified the actions of the Europeans. Resistance usually didn't work because Europeans used the use and dump method, which resulted in disqualification if you or your services were no longer needed and you started to prove stubborn. However, the complexity of Africans' political relationships among themselves influenced the nature of their resistance to colonial rule. As they resisted European invasions, they confronted both European and African soldiers. This means they confronted a political hierarchy imposed by Western Europeans that included African proxies. By 1914, 90% of Africa had been divided between 7 European countries, with only Liberia and Ethiopia remaining independent nations. Many of the boundaries drawn up by Europeans at the Berlin Conference still endure today, with little regard to natural landmarks or historic ethnic or political boundaries established by the Africans themselves. Partitioned ethnicities have suffered systematically more from civil conflict compared to groups that have not been directly affected by the improper border design. The exploitation of Africans' natural resources had helped European countries profit. However, in turn, newly independent African countries were beginning their sovereignty with little money or resources.
What happened at Berlin and the agreement at Berlin reflects what was happening. It's not the cause of what was happening, right? So you could possibly exaggerate how important this particular meeting is in creating the conflicts that result.